One of these days, I'm gonna get enough PC Optimum points to buy PlayStation 5.
Based? How many? How many is that?
Like they do bonus redemption, and so for 200,000 points, you can get $300 off, and I have like 200,000 points now.
I have no idea how
Nice.
many points I have, and I have not been shopping at that place in a long time. Should probably look into it. Get myself half off a PlayStation. All right, and we are live. So today we're going to be taking a look at the so-called "Don't Say Gay" laws that are being enacted in various states across America. I think a lot of people would have heard of this.
I'm jiving with "Don't promo the homo." I'm really
Hey, no homo promo, as it used to be called before it was called "Don't Say Gay." You know,
yeah. I actually think that's catchier.
Don't promo the homo.
it's definitely more boomer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The
So
rhyme.
yeah, at least it's got a rhyme in there. I think the "Don't Say Gay" is just far less creative. I think first what we'll do is kind of take a look at like the actual teaching of this stuff in schools, because these bills obviously purport to ban such teaching, and a lot of people say that there's no such stuff being taught, like critical race theory isn't being taught, gender ideology isn't being taught in school. It's just far right Republican psychopaths who are just trying to beat down the trans and gay community because they don't like them. So Hubbards, if you want to kind of lead us through some of the examples that you might have been finding of the material in schools.
Yeah, so I mean, for both CRT and gender ideology, there's like it's not that hard to go and find examples. Easiest one I found was like the Libs of TikTok account. Obviously, that's their whole shtick, is finding stuff like this. And so you can just like scroll it yourself for 15 minutes and find numerous examples. I found like, let's see how many, four various books, because the like a big part of the kerfuffle was like, oh well, now they're banning books. Like it's back to burning books, back to medieval book burning, and you find like the books that they have, and there's definitely some questionable stuff in there. Like I think the worst one was there's a book that's just essentially pornographic in every sense of the word, like has demonstrations of various sexual positions and various sexual acts and stuff, and it was made available in several elementary schools.
Are you telling me elementary students don't need their own infantilized version of the Kama Sutra?
Yeah, I think it might have been more explicit than that.
Oh yeah, this is like I'm looking at the book, and it is guys jacking off, women like full spread, full penetration, full like everything. It's disgusting. Like that, it's full blown porn.
Oh, and so it's like I don't really see a great argument to have that available in elementary schools. Like I don't know, and again, like there's numerous examples. There's another one that's given to like I guess middle school kind of ages, like 10 to 12, and that one's just explains how to have gay sex. Basically, is the premise of the book. And just like illustrations and diagrams and commentary on how to have gay sex, and for 12-year-olds, like again, like not that crazy, but I like again, parents might be the ones that want to make that judgment call at that age. Like they're 12, they're not teenagers yet, they're not adults, they're still potentially under their parents' pretty constant supervision. So I think there's a good argument to be made that parents should have the ultimate say. And then you can just look at like the CRT stuff as well. It's not that hard to find examples of it where there's CRT being taught. There's several polls that I found, just like polling children on whether or not they had heard of CRT ideology, and it wasn't a majority, but it was like, depending on the question, like a fairly sizable minority of the respondents had heard of the concepts and like the tenets of CRT stuff, like the U.S. is a white supremacist nation or whatever. It'd be like 20 to 30% of the respondents had heard of those terms in their classroom. So it definitely is happening, and it's definitely happening in more than just a tiny little niche fraction of schools. Like some sizable minority, of the very least, of school districts is bringing gender ideology and CRT teachings into the school for sure. And it just varies depending on the school district of how intense that introduction and how, I guess, age inappropriate it is, depending.
Well, the one thing with Florida, as far as I understood it, maybe this is an incorrect understanding, but it sounds like they're worried mostly about teachers kind of doing things on their own initiative, or individual schools doing things on their own initiative, because they're banning the teaching of sexual material to children under the age of 10. So that's third grade, I believe. And the actual curriculum in Florida calls for sexual education in grade 7. So there have been some critics that say they should have banned teaching sexuality in school until grade 7, because that's when it's supposed to be taught in school. So it may be that there are people that are kind of going off the rails in individual schools or individual classrooms, as opposed to following what you're supposed to do, in which case banning it is sort of one step further than just recommending that you teach in grade 7, which should imply that you don't teach it before grade 7. But I'm not sure that that's exactly what's going on, but that's kind of how I understood it.
Yeah, I think that is basically the concern. I think is like that there is like initiative on either the teacher's part or the particular school board or school district or whatever, to bring teachings like this into play, right? Like I don't think it's focused on the exact curriculum as like outlined by Florida State. It's just and in other states, right? It's a lot of this stuff is at the teacher's own initiative. And like when you go to talk about the books, those are just being made available. It's not like, to be clear, a lot of these books, it's not like they're required reading to pass your grade 2 class or whatever.
Yeah,
there's like
usually somebody in charge of stocking books for the school library that would make the call, and then presumably if they had this sort of ideological bent, they might bring in books that supported that ideological bent.
Well, yeah, there was
requested to be brought in.
Yeah, I think one of the examples that you had, Hubbard's, was the librarian, like showing off the books, right?
Yeah, it just it depends in each case, right? Like sometimes, but like the books I was discussing are not. I don't think in any of those cases where they're like required reading or brought into the classroom, as far as I could tell, they were just available in the library for any student to read if they decided to pick it up. So it's a little less like extreme in that sense.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I mean, that the basic point there was just that it is happening. I think we wanted to set that up, and then I guess we can get deeper into the bill, like the actual bills legislation that's been brought about.
Yeah, so I think the touchstone is the bill in Florida, even though, as we alluded to earlier, the no homo promo bills have predated that by a couple decades. So the no promo homo bills were, as far as I understand this as well, I'm not an expert in the field, but during the AIDS crisis, a lot of states kind of used the AIDS crisis to bring in anti-homosexual curriculums. So you couldn't talk about homosexuality at all in the school system, or if you brought up homosexuality, it had to be with the caveat that it's a dangerous lifestyle that can lead to AIDS, or homosexuality was only brought up when teaching about what causes AIDS as the only permissible time it could be broached in school. And those have been being struck down in various states because they're considered discriminatory since they specify homosexuality, which is why these new bills will all be talking about sexuality and gender identity as a whole. So technically including gender identity of men and women, not just all the weird gender identities, and technically including heterosexual sex, not just homosexuality. Or, yeah, heterosexual sexual attraction. So technically those are included in order to avoid being struck down for being discriminatory. And what the Florida bill says is no teaching sexuality until the end of third grade. And then after third grade, sexuality and gender can only be broached when age and topic appropriate. So that there's still a restriction. And the most worrisome thing, I think, for the activists that are against the bill is that the enforcement will be individual lawsuits by parents as opposed to a big bureaucratic government agency. So parents, particularly active parents, will be able to sort of bludgeon the schools into doing what they want by threatening lawsuits, or the schools will overreact to what the bill says in order to avoid any potential lawsuits. Because even winning a lawsuit that's brought against you is going to be an enormous waste of time and energy. Well, maybe not a waste, but it's going to use a lot of time and energy for these schools. So they'll just want to avoid the lawsuits in the first place. And so then they're very liable to overinterpret. Even though it says until grade 3, they might just ban sexuality being discussed in the classroom, period, outside of sex ed, or something along those lines, which isn't what the bill says, but might be what the result of the bill is.
Yeah, I think broadest possible interpretation is the worry, right? And yeah, exactly. It's the schools being, scared into that through litigation, which not unusual in the United States.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting. Some parts of the bill that didn't get any headlines or any discussion that I could see, or very little, seem pretty reasonable. One of it basically being that the school has to provide to all parents a list of like healthcare services that are being offered by the school, and then they have to get the parents' permission to administer any health procedures, essentially. And if they change their health procedures or available, they have to tell the parents. So I thought that was pretty basic and kind of uncontroversial, which again is why I don't think it got much.
Well, the only controversial part I saw there, and I believe it's the same section, is that they include mental and emotional health when they're talking about healthcare or well-being, such that the worry being a gay or, we'll just say gay or gender dysphoric child with parents that don't accept them would not be able to be treated by the school, whereas right now, or before this, they could be treated by the school or surreptitiously, which is the argument against the bill. But it's a pretty clear argument on the parent side as well that they don't want to be left out of what's going on with their kid. So it's not it's not a clear-cut thing in either direction, but the parents knowing, it's a pretty strong argument that the parents should know what's happening with their kid, even if they're bad parents.
Well, even in that section, I saw that there is exemptions for cases of abuse, right? So if the school suspects abuse, they can opt out of notifying the parent for like mental health counseling and stuff. So,
okay. I didn't see that because they were bringing it up from the other perspective. So
yeah, interesting that they left that out, eh?
Well, it is one of those things that's also going to be open to interpretation.
Yeah.
So.
And used as a loophole potentially.
Yeah, but it makes sense to have that as a loophole, but it seems to extend to like anything, right? Like, parents might. I think like parents might have a stigma, like might be stigmatized against like depression and not think it's real, right? And they might, you know what I mean? Like I really don't think the language in the bill like really targets, you know, specific gender identity or anything like that. It's like it parents just are being allowed to be involved in the decision making, and yes, there's going to be edge cases that are difficult to deal with there, but there seems to be language in the bill like that works on that, and it's not going to be perfect, but I think it's a pretty easy argument to be made that the overall intent and application of the bill's sound. It's just you always have edge cases, right? Like there will be abuse cases or whatever where it's going to be difficult to decide.
Yeah.
Do we exempt out or do we not? Like blah blah blah. So I don't know. It's
Well, it flips to the edge cases, whereas in a previous system, the edge cases would be where you had an activist school or school counselor that was pushing their own ideology onto the kid, and the parents didn't know anything about it. So, there's going to be edge cases any way you slice it.
yeah. I don't know. I don't think it's that difficult to imagine that parents like the default setting for any situation should be like let the parents know, right? Like
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good way to put it.
why
It's-
is it that school gets to be like this special case where like, oh, now all of a sudden parents
Don't need to
wishes
know.
and parents rights and parents wishes and parents involvement in their kids life is like plays second fiddle to the school. Makes no
And
sense to me.
one of
no
the
justification.
biggest red flags of abuse by like a groomer or a pedophile or anything like that is making sure that the kid is not notifying parents of things, right? And so if your default setting as a school is to not have the teachers involved, I think across the board that's extremely worrying, because that's exactly what like pedophiles and abusers do, right? They always try to isolate the kid from the parents. So I think just switching it to the default, parents always must be notified. And yes, like you were saying, there might be some edge cases where it's going to be really tricky and maybe there might be some mistakes made and that'll be horrible. But as compared to having the default case being not notifying the parents, it's just that there's so much more room for blatant abuse and bad behavior through not notifying parents, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the argument is just that, in most cases, the parents are going to be the ones with the child's best interest. Like, they're going to be the most capable of helping and working with the child because it's their child. So they're the most motivated. And that, like, seems to work well in every other setting. In terms of, like, making decisions about healthcare or making decisions about, school, which school, or all these types of things. We leave it to the parents because the presumption is parents are highly motivated to help their children succeed and do well.
Yeah, like who cares more about a kid? Somebody who's paid, $62,000 a year or less and sees them 8 hours a day and who's no relation to them in any sense, or the actual parents. Like, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that's makes sense to me. So I mean, that's a pretty deep drill down into just one specific part of the bill. I do think the don't say gay bills, because there's like, I don't know how many states at this point have more or less the same
As
type
far
of.
as I could find, there are about a dozen states that were bringing in similar legislation, as well as the states that still had a no promo homo bill have been modifying it in order to achieve similar results. So there's something around a dozen states roughly.
Because this is like the second, I guess, round in like the quote unquote anti-woke legislation in schools. The first was like CRT, critical race theory legislation banning the discussion of, and again, like each state has a different bill and different wording. But from what I could tell, more or less the the main thrusts of all the state bills around this the CRT stuff was that the schools couldn't teach something that made people made students uncomfortable or like guilty based on their race. So if it was like if it was content that was like based around making a particular racial group feel guilty about uh, their race, then that was banned. And also like basically sins of thy father type wording, where you couldn't teach stuff to say like you're somehow in the present day responsible for the actions of your ancestors, or words to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like I said, so many different bloody bills that it's hard to read through, even bait the highlights of each one.
Well, and those ones, as you said, have been around a bit longer. So those also have cases where they've been enforced by having individuals empowered to sue the schools. And there have definitely been some frivolous sounding lawsuits that have come out of that, where, according to the synopsis that I was reading, so it could be disingenuous, but people would sue the school for teaching about a certain black woman who was an opera singer. It's like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But they now have the legal power to start that lawsuit and be an asshole and take it to the courts and waste everybody's time, which is the reality of like what happens when you empower individuals to do these lawsuits that people are worried about with the don't say gay bills.
Yeah, so do we want to cover basically the arguments on either side of the fence, I guess, for and against?
Sure.
Because I guess I'll cover the for position in terms of like why these bills are necessary. Like we were highlighting at the very beginning, there's definitely content that is questionable, both in terms of the CRT stuff and the gender ideologies that are age inappropriate is like definitely one thing, and then just like I'd say generally just not congruent with your average person's view of the view and values, right? And I think the main argument made by people that support this legislation is it should be left to the parents. Like gender ideology, there's nothing there that's like absolutely imperative to be taught to a student who's 8, 9, or 10 years old that a parent can't impart if they deem it necessary, right? So it's like basically leave those decisions on that type of content to the parents. Teach the basics, math, reading, all that kind of thing, and stay away from stuff that veers deeply into value territory, and leave it up to parents to make that decision. And the other, I guess, side of that argument is like the reason it's appropriate to pass legislation, it would be argued, is that teachers and schools are funded by public money. Their teachers are public employees. Their salaries are paid by citizens. They are given a huge amount of resources. A huge chunk of anyone's tax bill is going to education. It's one of the biggest line items on a government's expenses, and therefore it should be the voters, the citizens, that have ultimate say on what's being taught. It should not be teachers who have and their bureaucratic administrators above them making these decisions without input from citizens. The people who vote for representatives, the representatives should be the ones that are allowed to make these decisions, not unelected officials and unelected employees that are not ultimately responsible to the voters. Like they can't get voted out, and therefore they shouldn't be making the decisions. It should be legislators.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if I will do a great job representing the anti side, but as far as I understand it, the arguments that I've seen really boil down to sort of the individual. Well, I'm sure there is an ideological thing out there, but the arguments that I've seen are really pulling on that sort of one-on-one individual experience and talking about how obviously LGBT children are already a minority that faces difficulties in life, and that this might further, or usually it's said this will further stigmatize LGBT in the schools, which will encourage more bullying and give them a worse life or worse childhood experience, and potentially lead to trauma or exacerbate existing trauma. So they're always example based as far as I saw. So one of the examples would be if a kid had same gender parents, so two mothers or two fathers, and then that kid was below third grade. Now, if they're talking about families, which apparently they do below third grade, then that kid asks, oh, why does everyone have a mom and dad and I have two dads? Or why does everyone have, or I have two moms? And the teacher's not allowed to explain that or talk about it in such a way that, in an ideal world, they'd explain it and the other kids would understand and it wouldn't be a weird thing. But now it's just basically left to the kids to interpret, and they're going to find it weird because it's not normal. And they won't be able to have the sage wisdom of the teacher to show them the way. So it'll be up to whatever they learned in their home life. And probably the kid could ask his two fathers or two mothers what it was about, but the other kids likely won't ask their parents, or if they do, they'll get conflicting things. So, it's that sort of appeal to the individual experience that they're worried about. And the weirdest one that I saw that I think is an overstretch, and this wouldn't be the individual experience, is things like women's history could be challenged as, being gendered. When you're teaching women's history could be challenged under this bill potentially. And it might be because, people are empowered to sue the schools. But it seems like that would be kind of taking it to an absurd level, because, banning discussion about the existing biological sexes is pretty clearly not the intent of the bill, even if it's technically within the purview.
Well, I think that brings up like two of the other main points I saw, which kind of are linked together, which is like broad interpretation and free speech, right? I saw a lot of talk about, especially with the CRT stuff, like free speech, like you're clamping down on the teacher's ability to speak freely in the classroom about what they believe or what they think, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
One counter argument I saw that I think is reasonably compelling is like the Supreme Court's already ruled on free speech in the classroom and determined that there is no free speech in the classroom for teachers.
That's what I was going to say. It's like, teachers aren't really able to say whatever they want, no matter what.
Teachers are public employees. You have no more free speech in the classroom than a lawyer does, or whatever another public employee does of the government in their position in that role, right? Like they're not allowed to say whatever they want, excluding the legal stuff. Like they have speech codes and code of conduct that prevents all sorts of
a pretty
things being said.
Easy counterexample to the free speech argument would be what would happen if a teacher started teaching that the Holocaust never happened. It's like that would get shut down pretty quick, and nobody would complain about free speech. Hopefully nobody would complain.
Well, yeah, very, very few people. The broad interpretation, I think that has a lot more weight, because if you put barriers to like any sort of restriction on what people can say that are, especially that are like very, very clearly defined and narrow in scope, then all of a sudden you're gonna self-censorship, right, is going to be the problem, where there might be actually great conversations that could have happened that don't happen in classrooms because teachers are just not willing to, risk their job or risk the schools standing and getting sued, blah blah blah. And I think that's a very like I don't see any like great counter argument to that other than like there is no really good counter argument. It's the U.S. People are going to sue the shit out of
Yeah,
the schools if they can, and they'll use any broad interpretation they can to like try to make a buck and raise a stink.
it's a good
And
point that it's always a compelling argument against any piece of legislation that it's vague or open to interpretation. That's and this is both of those things in most cases.
yeah, and like I was reading some of the stuff on the CRT, and it is worded like incredibly vaguely, where essentially it says like you're not allowed to teach things that make students uncomfortable about their race. It's like, again, now you're relying on the students' feelings of what makes them uncomfortable, and it's like, wow, children not very rational. They could probably be feel very upset about a wide range of things and could be completely unreasonable. Their concerns could be completely unreasonable. And also, I don't think the idea that you have zero uncomfortability or zero kind of like that's not a goal. It shouldn't be a goal at all to strive for, is having no conflict and no discomfort, no guilt when people learn about things. Like there's nothing wrong about presenting facts, and if it brings up guilt or other negative feelings, then that's a learning experience, like a learning opportunity for the student to like dig through that. Why are they feel guilty? Is it reasonable that they feel guilty? Is it reasonable that they feel uncomfortable? And what can they do about it? And like I don't know, that just seems crazy that you would make that a standard.
Yeah, that is a pretty wild standard. The one with the bill in Florida, as I mentioned, after third grade, it becomes age and content appropriate to talk about sexuality, where obviously there are going to be many judgment calls about what is age and content appropriate, because that will probably be the basis for most of the lawsuits.
Yeah, I saw less concerns on the gender ideology stuff about vague, like the free speech arguments and the kind of broad interpretation arguments were less prevalent, I saw, in terms of the gender ideology stuff. And like you were saying, really did seem to hone in on like that essentially vulnerable population, and like,
Yeah,
oh
that's a good
well,
way to put it.
yeah, like what if one person in the vulnerable population doesn't get like the fullest help that they could have got because there's these rules in place, essentially, was the argument that I saw consistently on that front.
Arguing with pathos, appealing to the emotions.
Yes. Sir, do we want to like anything else on the pro and the kind of the summation of the cases that we saw for and against?
One interesting thing I saw is a concern, and I mean this was from The Economist, their British paper, and they had a concern that it could be the start of a backslide in like gay and lesbian relations in the United States, just because it's been going so well in the United States in terms of, gay marriage is not that long ago by the Supreme Court, and then this year, I believe, or was it last year? Anyway, the Biden administration, they finally actually legislated gay marriage. Like America, by all metrics, has been doing very well at being less biased against gays and lesbians, so that this could be sort of an issue that causes a bit of a backslide because of how the gender ideology has been thrown in to everything. That the sexual attraction sexuality, which is gay and lesbian, could be caught in the sort of spread crossfire when gender ideology is under attack.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument. I think it is flowing from that. I do think there is some good discussion to be had around like lumping all the LGBTQ plus blah 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 together, right? Like I'd say if you talk to a lot of gay and lesbian people themselves, they would not necessarily want to have everything else after that included in their movement, right? And specifically for a lot of the reason you just mentioned, where things, it seems like in the United States, which again seemed to be a slow mover of all the Western countries, but in the Western countries more generally, like there has been a lot of progress being made, and then you get a reactionary movement against mostly what has been, trans ideology, and then they get rolled up into that for seemingly no reason. Like there really wasn't a lot of reactionary backlash to, like, say, the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. At least, it's a while ago.
Yeah,
now,
not as much as people expected, for sure.
Like, it was pretty quiet. Like, yeah, there was definitely, you had your Westboro Baptist Church, whatever, I think it was Westboro.
Yeah.
Whatever, banging the drums and stuff, and your certain evangelical groups and stuff. But, like, more or less, like, the broad strokes of American society did not really react that much to it, and life went on, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I've seen that argument from the people who are against gender ideology specifically, that they also don't like the LGBT because you're lumping in the gender ideology and sexuality. So it seems to be a tactic to, make, if you don't like gender ideology, then you must not like homosexuals. And it's like, that's something that the gender ideology is accused of doing on purpose, and probably does, because it makes their argument way easier.
Yeah, like the more kind of special interest groups you can try to lump in together, the more you can confuse the arguments and make it more about, like, the people rather than the issues, right? It's like, oh, well, you don't like this group of people, right? Rather than you don't like these ideas. It's like, yeah, I think there's definitely an element to that in the conversation.
So another thing that I saw in some of the states that isn't quite the Don't Say Gay bill, which is probably, well, it's definitely less controversial, but it still is controversial, is either to have an opt-in or an opt-out of all instruction, either relating to gender identity or just relating to sexuality as a whole. So opt-in is obviously stronger because the school would have to send out a form and the parents would have to return it that their child could attend the education on sexuality or gender identity. And then opt-out would be that the schools are required to give notice that they are doing this and what the curriculum is, and then the parents can send in a paper that tells the school not to teach their kid that. And those seem like a less controversial way of sort of giving power back to the parents.
Yeah, I think if you're against giving the option to the parents, that's kind of red flag to me. Like,
again, that's just exactly it's what I spoke about earlier, where if you are the type of person who doesn't want parents to be informed of things, you don't want parents to have options, it's like the type of people who do that are abusers, pedophiles. Like, that's the MO, right? That's exactly the type of, it's well documented as a part of the process of abuse, pedophiles, rapists, that type of stuff, right? Not saying that everybody who does that are those things, but that is the behavior.
Well, like, as you're saying, that's what, like, it facilitates anybody who would be doing those things.
Yeah, exactly.
People you don't want to facilitate.
On a less extreme note, like, or maybe not that less extreme, but that's also like classic cult behavior, right? Is isolate is you want to get people away from, especially their families, right? Any strong bonds that they have prior to the that were made prior to the joining of the cult, you want to sever those if you want to maintain your cult control, right? So yeah, it is kind of weird whenever people are saying things that would isolate and undermine like family and friendship bonds. That's always to me like very concerning, and
Yeah.
you better have an insanely good reason. And
That's exactly
yeah,
what the communists did. That's what, as you pointed out, that's what cults do. They go after the family. And if anybody who's going after the family, like the familial bonds, I think it's fair to say that they automatically should be like, you should automatically assume that they are up to no good. Like that should be the default setting if somebody does that.
but yeah, I think it's a good heuristic of like examine what exactly they're doing, and
Yeah.
when you notice that trend, because it's almost always not good.
Yeah, like 99.9% of the time that somebody's trying to do that, like it's because they're doing it to cause harm.
And I think that the thing that I think Price was talking about, where it's like, oh well, there's these vulnerable populations in these individual cases where, you know, the parents are actually the problem, and the school needs to step in and give the parents the power to resist, or yeah, sorry, give the child the power to resist their parents. I think there's like that's already why child protective services exists already, right? Like if it's
Good
not
point. Yeah.
like if it's not being covered under that, it's like that though there's already a big system that does that already, and it's like one of the most, I guess, complicated and difficult kind of processes is like when you step in and actually get a child out of their parents' quote unquote care because it's doing more harm than good. Well, there's already an apparatus that has been developed over the last few hundred years that the state runs to do that. Like it's not like it's not like they're dismantling child protective services. They're just bringing in legislation that lets you, or puts fences around what you are allowed to say. So I think like what Price was talking about with like those stories about, oh, how this person is going to be like horribly abused specifically because of this legislation. That's like, it seems more scare tactic than reality, because it's like the child protective services is going to be involved in those situations already, and if like make those better would be the argument. Like,
I think there would be people basically not trusting the government bureaucracy. Like, you know, child protective services, it's got to be a very extreme case before they'll actually take a kid away from their parents, which is a good thing. But I'm sure there are plenty of people who don't think it's a good thing that the conditions are so extreme.
yeah, but I
It's usually
guess
a last
that's a
resort
separate
thing, and then as we're saying, it's kind of a red flag if you think that shouldn't be the last resort.
Well, and if you believe that, then it's like you shouldn't be arguing. Or like fighting this bill is not the hill you should be dying on. The hill you should be dying on is expanding child protective services to be more, have more teeth and have an easier time taking kids away already. Like that would make
God, imagine actually proposing that though, as any public figure, you would just be lambasted.
Well, that's why I think they don't, right? Like they fight against this bill because it's a lot more defensible than saying, well, let's beef up child protective services to start taking more kids away, which would be like what would actually be needed to accomplish what they say they want to accomplish. But it's not politically palatable, so they hide behind.
Well, the other thing is that I think there's a general understanding, hopefully even among like those people, that taking like child protective services, taking a kid away usually is not a good result for the kid, even though it's hopefully ideally better than staying with their parents.
Yeah, a lot of like I remember reading into this, and a lot of the time when the child protective services takes a kid away, like it has unless it's like a truly extraordinary circumstance of horrible abuse, it normally is more negative for the kid to be taken away. Like it.
Yeah, so there's a slight. I could see people not understanding, like not following through their own logic they're using. Because if they did, they would reach that sort of conclusion, and then once they reach that sort of conclusion, they could look at what actually happens with child protective services, and then, we're kind of going on a tangent, I guess, and these people would have to go on a tangent to see their logic through, and then, it kind of shows the fault in the logic from following it through.
Yeah, I agree. Like it's not.
It's like your naive gut reaction is that this is going to, that the kids should have more help at school, just in case the parents are bad, and then you're like, oh, that would be better, and then but if you really look at what happens when parents aren't involved in their kids raising their kids, it's always a pretty enormous problem.
Yeah, and it's usually only like helpful in situations that are so extreme that they're going to be stick out anyway, right? Like you're not gonna it's not gonna be caught up in this particular issue. I do think there is something to be said for like the broad interpretation stuff not being great and there being better options, I guess, in terms of going after this stuff in schools. I don't know that again. Like I think there is distinction between the gender ideology stuff and the CRT stuff. Like I think they're different enough that they maybe don't have the same solutions or the same remedies in terms of what you do about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like personally, like after reading through the stuff and looking at a lot of this stuff, like the main conclusion I came to was like we need more charter schools and more like basically school choice. I think that would be more or less the most useful remedy to get stuff like this out of schools, because if you just offer people the option of what they're going to teach their kids, they're going to choose what they want their kids taught, and they're going to choose schools that teach those things, focus on those things. And my guess is schools that focus on fundamental, basic academic skills and leave a lot of the,
just don't even touch the gender stuff, like, not turning it into condemnation or anything like that, but just don't even bother with it.
Yeah, leave a lot of like third rail topics like gender ideology and, critical race theory and just like a lot of those things. Just leave it at the door and, kind of, don't touch it because it's not worth it, and just focus on skills. I think those schools will do a lot better than ones that, gung-ho, go on political crusades and teach kids these things as like their primary purpose. And it'll be pretty obvious within a few years or whatever that if you want your kids to actually learn and develop and be, ahead of the curve in terms of skills, you send them to the schools that just teach the basics and stick to the basics. And then those schools will get the funding, they'll get the applications, they'll grow.
Yeah, the wait lists will become fucking extreme.
And if the other schools want to keep flogging on with the third world issues and pumping them out, then they'll shrivel and die. And if they want to have any hope of staying relevant and actually staying open, they'll fix their curriculum and they'll stop hiring teachers that bring those topics up. They'll start
blue-haired crazies.
Well, and they'll start bringing in their own rules about what can be taught in the classroom and what needs to be focused on in the classroom, and what how getting back to basics and stuff like that. I think it'll be self-reinforcing, right? Like the incentive structure, just like if you're staring down the barrel of your school closing and being out of a job, it'll probably right the ship in terms of
Yeah,
focus
it'll at
on.
least push a lot of that stuff into the background. Like you might still have a bit of it here or there, but it'll become far less of a focus, which, while not ideal, like I think it would be much better for the stuff to be completely stamped out in terms of like it being pushed in education. Like at least it would take a back seat.
Well, I guess, you know, my personal view too is it'd be better if this stuff wasn't taught at all. But I think if you want to get there, the question is, how do you get there? And do you legislate it? Do you, you know, or do you like? What are the solutions? And I think maybe legislation has a part to play, but I'm less like, especially on the CRT stuff and the bills that I saw there. I'm not that convinced that it's a great solution. Uh, just like a great singular solution, because again, it does dampen down people's ability to say, have conversations that are good, and it also probably isn't the most effective in terms of getting the stuff to exit the pipeline, uh, because so much of it is at like the individual teacher level, right?
Yeah,
I
because
think you
all you
need.
need is that one teacher in the school who just keeps pushing it, right? Like,
Well,
unless.
and you have certain school districts that are full of teachers that are like, pretty woke and teach stuff like this, and school districts that are full of students and parents that are pretty woke. It just won't. These bills won't do much because the enforcement mechanism is lawsuits, right? And it's like, well, these schools just won't bring lawsuits. Like there won't be lawsuits brought because everyone in that school district broadly agrees, right?
Yeah, and that's where
Yeah.
I think something like you were saying, charter schools, like having that choice is great because, if you want to have your kids taught a bunch of harmful garbage, well, and the people that don't can pull their kids out and put them to a different school, then I go right ahead. I think you're doing your child a huge disservice, and I think you're a pretty shitty parent. But I at the same time, like you're the parent. If that's your choice, then go ahead. So long as you're not actually like viciously harming your child, I see no reason to try to step in and say you cannot have this stuff taught. And I just don't want my child to be a part of it. And yeah, that's where that choice comes into play, right? If you want to have a school full of like woke idiots, then go ahead.
Well, I think like you have to look at consequences, right? I think like the CRT stuff, it's hard to really make a strong case that like there's some calamity that's going to come from teaching kids a lot of this stuff. Like, I do agree that, or I do think that the some of the most extreme stuff in CRT is harmful, but it's not like physically dangerous. Whereas you look at the gender ideology stuff, I do think there is actual physical danger with the trans stuff, and like
Oh, absolutely.
you have the what's the term for it? You have like basically contagious trans identity stuff in, especially in girls friend groups where like 12 girls at the same time will declare they're trans, and then you go and look at the landscape of how easily it is for young people to get actual medical intervention. And I guess my contention would be that the legislation should be focused on preventing the medical intervention, not on preventing the ideology.
I do
Like,
think, and that is starting. Like there are various states who are starting to put that in place, like the legislation basically banning transition of minors, like outright.
well, yeah, yeah. When researching this, that did come up, and that's definitely, yeah, is happening. Like Florida being another notable example, with basically the first was the medical association in Florida that made it against their, I don't know exactly how they're governed, but it's already against the Florida Medical Board or medical agency or whatever's guidelines to provide any sort of gender transition care to minors. But now there's legislation being brought in to put some like penalties for doctors that violate that.
Yeah. I just want to kind of go over, go over an example of what you mean by medical harm. So there's quite a few people who are now coming out as detransitioners, and most of them are females who wanted to transition to males. And a lot of this starts when they're, like sometimes even 10, right? And then they'll jump on puberty blockers and have double mastectomies by the time they're 15. And so for people saying that, oh, these, if you just jump on puberty blockers and then stop later on, it's fine. It's like, no, that when you screw with your hormone levels at puberty, especially, that has all sorts of long-term consequences. And then, of course, having a double mastectomy is devastating. Like, it's a massive surgery. And so you're having a ton of these kids who are, like, what it does to them is it completely ruins their ability to have kids. They can't breastfeed a lot of the time, like a double mastectomy, obviously, but just even puberty blockers are enough to do some serious damage. Severe sexual dysfunction as they age, like it's like the physical consequences, regardless of what the activists say, are extreme. Like these are major league surgeries and treatments that, even an adult should have a lot of skepticism undertaking. Like a double mastectomy for cancer treatment is like, it's brutal. It's so hard on women, and to imagine doing that at 15, like it's just it's going to destroy a huge amount of people who get into this. And a lot of the time it's driven by like the teachers and whatnot who are encouraging it. A lot of it is social media. I'd say the bigger part is like social media, but a lot of it does come from like the teachers, the counselors, and whatnot. So again, like to say that this ideology is not being, it's not being taught, and it doesn't have much of an implication, even if it is. It's just making people like more aware and more aware of like trans and that type of thing, and making them more open and kind about it. It's like, that's complete horseshit, and it's very easily disproven. There's a number of people suing doctors and whatnot now because of the basically over malpractice, because these young girls are now sterilized. They have all sorts of sexual dysfunction, all sorts of just if you have major surgeries, a lot of the time you have to keep going to the doctor because they have knock-on effects throughout the rest of the body, and those last for years, right? I think in a place like Canada, it's like good fucking luck suing anybody over this stuff. But in the States, I'm hoping that these lawsuits will actually start to curb things. And you saw that in the UK, they shut down the Torvastock clinic where they were just transitioning everybody who walked through the door, and the government shut the whole thing down.
I find it incredible how fast the landscape has shifted. Like maybe Canada's been a bit behind the curve, but I remember around 2014 taking some psychology courses, and there was lively debate around whether or not it was ethical to have a surgery to address a psychological illness, like that being transgender. This was before puberty blockers and stuff were really on the menu, and within, what's it been now, 9 years, it's now the default to do physical irreversible changes.
It's not even the default, it's the legally mandated one. In Canada.
Depends where you are.
In Canada, it's legally mandated, which is fucking insane.
Well, gender affirmation is legally mandated.
Yeah,
which that you have to. You don't have to do the physical changes, but the counselors are not allowed to counsel you, but to affirm your self-identified
almost
gender.
Inevitably is going to require surgery, right? Like if you carry down that road, that's where it always leads. So it's not saying the counselor has, like the treatment plan does not have to include it, but it almost always will. So indirectly, it's basically
popular with very little. Like it snuck up. It feels like just all of a sudden it became the norm for this rather than being an enormous debate. Like it was a big debate whether or not it should be done at all. And then obviously, maybe in academia, that's probably still going on. But in the real world, they eventually decided, oh yeah, we should do it. And then it just became the default.
It's kind of funny. I don't know. This my observation is, well, not mine, but like, it seems like this is for girls, like the transgender thing is like the 1990s version of like being a lesbian, right? Like girls now like identify as I'm a trans man, or I'm non-binary, whatever, trans, and that used to like happen all the time in like trendy circles for teenage girls, but they would just say they're lesbian, like in the 90s or whatever. They're like, oh yeah,
they kiss their friend once and then they're lesbian.
And they're lesbian until that, halfway through college, then they're not. And that was like just a very common thing.
Oh yeah, I know a number of girls who went through that.
And then for guys, it's just like, it seems like just basically fetishism, right?
Yeah,
and
autogynephilic.
Between those two like phenomenon, you just like had a explosion in quote unquote trans people. And I think like, I also took psychology courses like years ago now, that the conversation was like similar to what you were saying, Price, where it was like, like for these very tiny fraction of people. And back when I like was in psychology, like our textbooks, it was like the number that they were quoting in my textbooks was like 1 in 10,000 to like 1 in 2,000 was kind of like the range of estimate for like how many people are transgender. Now you look at it in surveys of like the younger kid, like teenager to early 20 age group in the US, it's 2% of people are claiming to be trans. So it's gone up
crazy,
like 100-fold in terms of prevalence, which is clearly not driven by anything other than
social contagion.
Social contagion and other like mimetics essentially. And I think like the conversation was difficult for those people that were actually like really gender dysphoric trans people. I don't know what else to call them, like OG trans. Like, I don't know what you wanted. And
it was just so different how it was all treated and discussed,
because it was like a different phenomenon, right? It was like this tiny fraction of people that actually have this like really weird problematic issue that is never going to resolve itself, and what do you do? And there was like very, I think, decent nuanced conversations about like what to do, and it was not I don't think there was any like clear indication of there being a perfect answer. And it was I think handled the right way, in the sense like it seemed to be, because the main kind of thrust of it was people were given treatment on an individual basis, and they were asked about, why do you feel like you're transgender? Why do you feel like you're in the wrong body, et cetera, et cetera? And after working through it, then they were provided options and, possibilities of what to do next, right? Which seems to be the only way to really do medicine properly is.
I have a theory as to why like it exploded so suddenly, and I think it comes down to like just it was seen as like an ideology, as like a tool for ideologues to further their power, right? Like, because if you can convince people that men or women, there's no sexual categories, it's all the same, you can basically derail reality for people, and it makes them way more susceptible to being fed other lies. Like I think that because like sex is a category that human beings have used to make sense of the world, right? Because sex is it's over 1 billion years old, and human beings were evolved creatures. We categorize like we actually have to take from nature and our own environment in order to start building out representations of the world and ability to categorize it. And so sex, like two genders being one of the primary ways that we do that, right? That's why you see two gendered languages and like all sorts of different things are gendered in that way. It's a way for human beings to make sense of the world.
I think one of the weirdest things with English, and I think it has something to do with the way gender relations are in the Anglosphere, is that I believe English is the only living Indo-European language that has no genders. And that was just a random fluke of an aristocracy in England that didn't speak the language and kind of dumbed it down. As far as I've read, basically a Nordic aristocracy that learned English as a second language and dumbed it down by not learning the gendered words and just using one word. And then that, because the aristocrats did that, then it filtered down to everybody.
That's
But
rather
I think it
interesting.
had long-term gender relationship consequences in the Anglosphere, just with the way we use language.
Yeah, well, and that actually leads back into the point, right? Like human beings, we use, like the way that we categorize the world is the way we make sense of the world, right? And sex being fundamental to nature itself, we use sex as a way to help make sense of things. Like, so we gender things and represent things gendered and whatnot, and that's completely normal, and that's what all cultures do. It's not something like, oh, just like the West does that or something. It's like, it's seen across basically all cultures. And I think a big part of the reason why this trans stuff became incredibly, like, it just went from 0 to 100 is, I think, people who were looking to flip, I guess what you would call like the power structure in the West, viewed it as a tool to be able to do that. Because if you can dismantle gender as they would call it, it's just a social construct, right? Like if you can convince people of that, you can convince men or women, women or men, you can switch between the two. You can basically convince them of anything. And therefore they're using that as a method to just shake people's ability to make sense of the world, and then they can enforce their own views of the world. And that's you see that with that's exactly what the political gender activists are doing, right? Like they are taking this and saying, it's an obvious power play by those people, and that's why I think it became so, why it was so rapidly went from being like a discussion on intellectual grounds of what's moral about transitioning and doing surgeries on something that's has a massive psychological bent to it as an issue, going from that rational, reasonable discussion and treatment of gender dysphoria to this insane thing that we have now that's cutting the tits off of 14 and 15-year-olds. I think
there's kind of two aspects, because what you're describing, I'm sure, is how things would happen on sort of a top-down, academic or influencer level. But the other thing being just the social media in the last 10 years. And the effect that kids have had growing up on it, and they're as kind of a grassroots or a bottom up situation where it becomes mimetic, and it gets into the cultural milieu, and these kids are just it's social media has facilitated memes in the true sense in a way that just
so before. I would absolutely agree with that. I'm not saying that this is like a cabal of 20 people globally who are doing this evil power play, conspiracy theory. I think there's definitely some of that in terms of higher up intellectuals at universities and whatnot who are pushing this and who do really see it that way. But it's also a part of just bottom up. And if you didn't have some of that bottom up, which is I think a really big component, those people would still be in the ivory tower screaming out the window, and most people would not give a shit, and it really wouldn't have gotten where it has.
Anyone who's done a class on postmodernism would know it's blatantly obvious that deconstructing binaries is part of their way of going about their philosophy.
Yeah, and
Yes,
like
it
I've
is
read a lot of that
the
shit.
binary.
Yeah, and I've read a lot of their stuff, and there's a number of those thinkers in that postmodern space that they explicitly made like this is they state that these are tools to be used to destroy and rebuild, society in the way that they see fit. Like some of them say that directly. Like Marcuse, there's a few others. Marcuse is not really, he's not gender, but like the generation underneath of him, like that studied underneath of him, say that as well. He was much more like left right political binary in a sense. Like that's what he was going after. But he was very explicit in saying like, we need to silence the ability for conservatives to even think. Like he said that directly. Like so there is definitely for those who think that it's a little it's conspiratorial and that's not how it works. It's like like quite a number of these thinkers, if you go and read their works, like they're very much intent on demolishing society and rebuilding it in the way that they think is correct.
Well, I think, yeah, that's true. Bringing it back to the more on topic, Price was talking about like the ground up social kind of social media consequences and social media conversation. I think that's why the legislative approach to like getting these ideas under control through, especially like school, it's just a losing battle, right? Like if you want to get these things under control, you're going to have to get the end result consequences under control, because that's something you actually could legislate out of existence. Like you can put into effect bans on medical practitioners giving medical intervention to minors to transition them. Like that's just something that actually would work in a Western society where there's going to be hardly any doctors that are willing to risk their license and jail time or whatever doing underground transitions on people under 18. And that's why I think, especially for the gender one, the gender ideology stuff, it's like I'm not sure how much of that you should really be restricting in school. I think I am sympathetic to the idea that it should be voters and the electorate that decides what gets taught in school, because yes, teachers and schools are public institutions that are funded by public taxpayer dollars. They should have a strong say in what those teachers teach and what the schools allow. And there isn't any, I don't think, any like broad free speech concerns that you can plausibly bring up.
Yeah, because it's not restricting the teachers from going on social media in their own time or yelling in the public square.
Yeah, and they're responsible as public employees to say what teach what they're been told to teach. And if they don't like being a public employee, then they can quit.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, public employees in all different aspects, different jobs, have certain restrictions that they face in their conduct and what they can say on the job. Tough. That's life. So I do. Yeah. So I think like focusing in on the consequences is more important, and putting like a kibosh on that, because you're never gonna, like, what are you gonna do? Like at that point, then you're gonna have to go after like social media in general, and you're gonna
that'll end well.
Yeah.
Florida doesn't have the power to shut off YouTube and shut off TikTok and shut off Instagram. So like, don't bother with that. Focus on the things you can actually control.
The Great Florida Firewall. I can see it already.
Well, and the other thing that we haven't talked about as much, but I think is important, along with like charter schools, is just making becoming a teacher easier, because a lot of this comes down to teachers, and they're the ones that actually where the rubber meets the road in terms of instructing kids. And a big problem with teaching in general right now, and this is not just the US, this is like Canada is notorious for this is like the education schools, you know, Department of Education at universities have basically a lock on accrediting K through 12 teachers. So you have to get either a full 4-year program education degree, or you have to, like, depending on the jurisdiction and the state, you have to get at least some sort of like 1 or 2 year program on top of your bachelor's, such that you can even teach K through 12. And from what I've seen out of the education schools, only actually crazy, insane, indoctrinated weirdos, for the most part, would ever consider going into an education school, a Department of Education at a university, and getting a 4-year degree there, because they're like the most ideologically captured, like woke, shit shows in the universities. Like, they're the worst of the worst, and that obviously just like dissuades anyone who's moderately conservative, or just kind of like not into the whole ideology and doesn't like want to give diversity and equity oaths and all that kind of thing. And then that selects for a certain type of teacher, right? And so a big part of the problem is just like the pipeline of teachers in Canada and the US more broadly is pretty terrible, because the education departments are pretty terrible. So if you just made it such that you have a bachelor's or a master's in an appropriate program, you can teach that subject at school, I think you'd have a lot more like people willing to teach part-time or full-time, or try it out for a couple of years, and you'd get, I think, pretty rapidly better quality teachers. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if somebody gets a chemistry bachelor's degree and wants to come and teach the high school chem, they don't have to go through multiple years of education, and they can just step in, see how they like it. It might be good to have like some training on like how to kind of deal with kids and whatnot, but it could make it pretty.
Almost seems like
like
something you
the
could.
job thing. Like, Jesus,
Yeah,
Christ,
exactly.
we have fucking 20-year-old, the smart girl from the school, or from the county, who ran a whole schoolhouse back in the day. Like,
Yeah.
humans are a little bit more adaptable and capable. You don't need to put them through a fucking degree program to figure out how to tell kids to shut the fuck up and listen. Like, it's not that complicated. You can learn that on the job, and if you really, really, really cannot do it, then quit or get fired. Like, people will figure the shit out. Like, we throw people into the meat grinder on jobs that are much more difficult and dangerous than goddamn teaching, for fuck's sakes.
When you have principals and vice principals, they're probably sitting around doing nothing anyway that could help acclimatize the new hires.
Heaven forbid administrators do work. That would be the last. That's the last straw. That's the last straw. And honestly, like in Canada, teaching, depending on the province, can actually pay like quite well. And it's like, especially if you consider like the like hourly, I guess, rate essentially is like, you get quite a bit of vacation time, and if you kind of get your curriculum dialed in and your instruction dialed in, you're not doing a terrible amount of prep work. You can actually have a regular 8-hour day and 3 months off during the year.
Well, and your time off coincides with your kids' time off, which is enormous.
Yeah, perfectly aligns with kids as well. So it's like, I think for a lot of people, they wouldn't mind giving it a try, right? And if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit, move on. But you could expand the pool of potential teachers a ton, and you combine that with school choice. I think that would be like in my mind, that's like the kind of more market orientated solutions that would start to make a real dent in the quality of schools. And that's goes above and beyond just addressing these kind of narrow, like, curriculum focused.
It would apply to a whole bunch of different things, like just general competence of teachers and whatnot, and, engagement in the material. Like, you might see a very good uplift in the overall quality.
Yeah, it's like there's a lot of people that have like master's degrees in like biology or chemistry or whatever. Like, they're very competent at these specific subjects, but they they're not going to consider teaching because they don't want to do another 4-year bachelor's or even do another 1 or 2 or 3 years of like accreditation, some sort of program. And it's like if you give them a path to do it very easily and you make it like and you actually like start hiring these people, like you start advertising saying like, are you good at this subject? Do you know your way around mathematics? Come teach.
Yeah, like who wants to be taught grade 11 or grade 12 chemistry by a fucking like not a very bright but just willing to go through the bachelor's degree of education. It's like
The funniest experiences I've had have always been, and it always seemed to be, at least when I was growing up, that every second teacher was an English major.
Exactly.
Like they would do 4 years of teaching and 2 years of English, and then they'd be teaching physics or they'd be teaching chemistry, and they had no idea what.
Yeah.
The last time they did physics or chemistry was when they were in high school.
Yeah, and they sucked at it then. That's why they went in
with a bachelor's in the topic.
Yeah, exactly. They sucked at it then, and no reason to believe that their skills improved.
I just hated having to teach teachers the stuff because teachers usually get in their minds that kids teaching them stuff is a bad thing, and then they don't like you because you're teaching them the topic because they don't understand it, and it's like, yeah, well, I mean, you could have put in a bit more effort.
Yeah, you clearly don't understand the topic, and you're just like, right, like,
Yeah,
man, I had
just like I do.
yeah, I had a couple teachers like that, and it just turned me off of like the subject, physics in particular.
Physics was the worst.
Yeah,
Nobody
just like
had any clue about it because you didn't get people that were physics majors. It seemed like, well, at least, yeah, where I was, it just was not a common thing to do with your teaching.
Well, and it, like, to be blunt with, like, though, a lot of those majors, too, don't have a great other employment prospects. Like,
Yeah.
you have a master's in biology. There is obviously jobs, but, like, they could be within the field of biology. It's pretty slim pickings, like some lab jobs and stuff, and they don't pay tremendously a lot of the time and stuff because there's
you need your
lot of people.
PhD. Usually,
There's a lot of people that are interested in like biology, and so that's pretty saturated. It's like, well, what a great outlet for those people that are smart, very knowledgeable in the
and
area,
they like it.
passionate about the subject, and it's like, hell
Yeah.
yeah, go teach people that in that subject, and
Yeah, it would be.
why not?
It would be such a. I think. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it would just be a big boon overall. Seems ridiculous that we have to have teachers accredited through one particular thing. And the problem is because it's a monopoly, they can just dictate whatever ridiculous terms that they want onto the people. Like, I'm a professional and I have that same problem in my area because I have to respond to and do the things that my accreditation organization demands, and a lot of it is corrupt horseshit, to be quite frank.
I don't really have much else.
I think the only thing that would be is like just for the regular person, like, what does this all mean for them?
Homeschool your kids.
Move to
Yeah,
Florida.
I don't know how the U.S. works. I think it varies a lot, but in Canada, like, homeschool or send your kids to private school.
Yep, that's definitely. Well, one of the things that I would say is, if you're in Canada and you do have to send your kid to public school because homeschooling and private school are not going to be reasonable for you, I think just check in on the school, like, do your homework, make sure that you're asking for copies of the syllabus and, figure out what they're actually teaching. And then if they are putting in crap that you don't agree with, raise a fucking fit. That's, I got a kid and he's going to be going to school at some point, and that's what I plan on doing. Like if it turns out that public school or homeschool is going to be, or private school or homeschooling is not really an option for us, like, I absolutely intend on doing that. Just going to be,
I think
be reasonable about it, but like, I'm not going to put up with any horseshit. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to teach my kid about, like, how to jerk somebody off when they're fucking grade 2.
It's a life skill.
Well, like, actually,
You never know when you might need to jerk yourself out of a tight situation.
Forget self-defense.
You ever seen a guy run away as fast as when he pulled his pants down and started jerking him off?
In Canada, I think one thing to think about is religious schools. Like, Canada has actually a lot of Catholic and other Christian, well, even Jewish schools that are like funded publicly and therefore have like fairly reasonable, either free or fairly reasonable tuition costs, because they get public funding, because they're technically like.
Oh yeah, that's what I meant by private school, because I was thinking of religious schools, but you're right, they are publicly funded.
Yeah, so that a lot of the time they will have like little to no tuition because they're getting public funding, and they're like on par with public schools in terms of like their status. I know that's like the case in Ontario and even I think Quebec. Like, most provinces have like some sort of religious school system that's well funded by the public. And I think the U.S. has a certain degree of that as well. So that's
Depends on
definitely
the
one
state,
thing.
from what I could tell.
Yeah, it's the same in Canada. Like, not every province has that option, but so that's definitely something to look into. I mean, you should also still pay attention to what they're teaching at those schools.
Yeah. Oh,
It's,
yeah. 'Cause sometimes
it's not-
that shit goes sideways.
It's not like it's just like a get out of responsibility free card. I don't think, but I also agree with Con. Like, just get a seat on your whatever, the PTA or whatever it is. Sit on your school board, get involved in the school,
Yeah.
and you'll have a lot more say in what your kid. And not only will you have more of a say in what actually happens, you'll also be just more informed, right? Like, that's like half the battle. Is just knowing what the fuck's going on with your school, and the best way to do that is just get yourself involved with the board and all that kind of thing, and the conversations will come out, and you'll hear from other parents, blah blah blah. You'll start to learn what's going on.
Yeah, and if you are running into these problems, it's like, go reach out to other parents. Like, a lot of other people are not going to put up with this shit, or are not happy with it either. They just need they just need a network of people who are going to stand up to it. So if you're finding this stuff like in your school and you don't agree with it, there's definitely going to be probably quite a number of parents who wouldn't agree with it as well, but they might not know about it, right? And you just get, like Hubbard's is saying, get involved to have yourself informed and let other people know. The vast majority of parents don't want, ridiculous shit being taught to their kids, and kick up a fuss. Like, a lot of these woke people are useless cowards. Like, they'll fold under pressure. But if they don't fold right away, like, just, you got to keep the pressure up.
Well, and there is like mechanisms just in place because they're public institutions. They should be, they should be responsible to the public, and there are mechanisms like boards and stuff that oversee it. So there's lots of people are lazy and will not get involved. So if you are willing to get involved, you'll have an outsized amount of influence and power.
Yeah.
Pretty much by default, because everyone else is
just not going to do anything. Yeah. Exactly.
Abdicate the responsibility and abdicate like the effort and just not get involved. And
just doing things pretty much puts you in the top 10%. Like, that's just how it works. Like, if you're just doing something, because like you were saying, Hubbard, it's like virtually everybody doesn't. You'll be able to get done a lot of things that you want to have done. And I think a lot of this stuff isn't going to require like a huge amount of commitment out of a person. It's not like you have to work 80 hours a week on something like this. Like, I mean, you could always work more, like as much as you wanted, but like, I don't think something like getting involved within your kid's school, it's not going to be a massive time commitment. It's.
Well, it doesn't have to be, right?
Yeah, you could turn it into that, but you could get a lot done
Honestly,
with
just like
small amount of time.
attending the meetings or whatever is probably like one meeting a month, and it's probably like a couple hours. So it's like you could be pretty well informed and like have some sort of influence with literally like maybe 2 or 3 hours a month.
Yeah, and then you put that to 2 or 3 hours a week, and you might be able to do quite a bit more than you ever thought possible. And I think in terms of protecting your kids, like, is that not worth your time? Almost certainly yes. All right, well, that's pretty much everything I had to say.
Same.
All right.
Same.
Thanks for listening. Peace.